Hello, Chag Sameach. I very foolishly forgot to press the record button on my session at the Tikkun Leil because I was too busy managing the tech for everyone else. So I am going to reconstruct it as best I can here. And what we're looking at is the idea of choosing our bedfellows. Just to frame this a little bit, I want to give some examples of how this issue arises in the daily life of rabbis, cantors, synagogue chairs, and everyone who's involved in running communities. The first area where it arises is in terms of the promotion of events. Very often, communities are asked to advertise external events, and generally, they're external events of a sort that we would agree with in principle. In Brighton, for example, there is an annual Stand Up to Racism march. Anti-racism is a cause that my congregation agrees with. The difficulty, though, is that Stand Up to Racism is associated with the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party has a litany of problems with it, including a serious failure to tackle sexual violence by its members. And so the question is, do we want to promote the event because we believe in the cause, or are we worried about the bedfellows issue? Another area where the bedfellows issue arises is in relation to MPs. We've got local MPs. As a synagogue, we want to engage with them positively. However, what about if they have views that some or all congregants find problematic? Open letters poses a similar challenge. Rabbis are always being asked to sign open letters, and the first question is always, who else has signed it? Whose name am I going to appear next to on the list of signatories? And interfaith relations poses another area. How are we going to work with interfaith partners who may or may not have different views or beliefs or ideologies? And the final area is the police. The police is an institution that we all know has issues around institutional racism, around the use of violence. On the other hand, we have to have a relationship with the police in order to keep our congregation safe. And striking that balance is something that, again, comes down to this bedfellows issue. Just before we dive into what the Jewish texts have to say, I want to highlight the three reasons why we might theoretically be concerned about a bedfellow. The first reason is what I call live issues. Live issues means we might be concerned about what the person with whom we're partnering will say or do while we're partnering with them. So if I were to invite an external speaker into my synagogue, I need to be confident that they're not going to express Islamophobic views live present in the building. That would be a really problematic thing to happen. The second concern is about integrity. And there, the issue isn't what they'll say live while they're in the building. The issue is about what they stand for more generally and what, therefore, we might be seen to endorse by partnering with them, by giving them our hechsher, our kosher certificate. We'll come on to that in a little bit. And the third issue is around relationship building. Refusing to partner with someone can damage a relationship, but also partnering with someone can damage a relationship. As a synagogue, we have a really positive partnership with our local Muslim community. And so there are certain groups that if we worked with them, the Muslim community would lose confidence in us. And vice versa. There are groups that we would deliberately want to work with because by failing to work with them, we wouldn't maintain the relationship that we need. Those are three very broad headings of why we'd be concerned. And the only other issue before we actually do dive in is, why is this to do with dissent? What is this how is this connecting to the theme of dissent for our Tikkun Leil? And the answer is that the bedfellows issue always involves defying expectations in some way or another. Sometimes there is an expectation that we will climb into bed with people who share our beliefs on a particular issue, no matter what. So the rally a couple of weeks ago against anti-Semitism is a classic example of that. The expectation was that the entire Jewish community would cooperate and participate in that rally because we oppose anti-Semitism, the rally opposes anti-Semitism, case closed. However, for me, the dissent was saying, actually, I'm really uncomfortable with a lot of the people involved in the organising and platform of that rally. And so I am going to defy the expectations by not endorsing it, notwithstanding that I support the fight against anti-Semitism. The other angle is sometimes we defy expectations by taking a bedfellow. Sometimes the Jewish community expects us to boycott, blacklist, cancel whatever language we're going to use certain organizations or groups, whereas actually we might think it's important to engage somewhat. One example would be there's a Palestine group in Brighton who posted something really appalling on their social media. I contacted them to say, "Hi, I'm a rabbi, not okay." They were falling all over themselves to apologize. And since then, I've gone out to have coffee with the organizers. I've talked to them about what is and isn't appropriate, what isn't going to upset the Jewish community. That's a really positive relationship that I was only able to have by defying the expectation that I would treat these people as the enemy and completely untouchable. All right, that's enough introduction. Let's see what the sources have to say. We're starting with a set of sources about relationships with the ruling authorities, but we'll come on to what's meant by the ruling authorities in just a moment. We're starting with Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Sages, chapter 1, in which Shemaiah used to say, "Do not become friendly with the ruling authorities." And Bartonura, who's an Italian commentator a few centuries later, gives us some really important clarity on why and what that means. First of all, he says, don't become friendly with the ruling authorities in order that you do not come to transgress the will of your creator. So this is a really important concern, and it recognizes the fact that actually any of us have multiple tiers of ruling authorities. So in my case, for example, I've got my synagogue council. They're my employers. They rule over me to some extent, maybe not as much as they'd like. That's as maybe. Then we have national government, the law, the local council, all these, the secular authorities of our society. But Bartonura is reminding us that God is also one of these ruling authorities as well. And quite often, the demands of these different authorities will conflict with each other. If they all line up, that's fine. It doesn't really matter. When they conflict with each other, Bartonura is saying it's really important not to have put yourself into a position where you are beholden to earthly ruling authorities in a way that means you have to do what is wrong in the sight of God. But he also goes on to clarify what is meant by ruling authorities. So the word used in the Mishnah consistently is reshut, which literally means the empowered. And so Bartonura says it means anyone who is dominant, anyone who has the power to do what they want. And so that doesn't actually just mean employers and the police and the government. It means anyone who exercises power more generally. So in a Jewish context, we're thinking about the Board of Deputies exercises some level of power and influence in our community. Also, the community itself, the general voice of consensus that we might get from the Jewish Chronicle or from Jewish social media, all these sources are the ruling authorities in some way or another because there is a dominance, there is a power imbalance between that consensus and the individual. We return to the theme of the ruling authorities a couple of chapters later in Pirkei Avot, where we have Hevu Zahirin, be careful with the ruling authorities, for they do not befriend a person except for their own ends. They seem like friends when it is to their own interest, but they do not stand by us at times of distress. Now, it's important to be clear about the historical context of these remarks. They were being used in a period of Roman rule when the relationship between the Jewish community and the actual ruling authorities was rather more tense than it is today. But the idea that's encapsulated here is eternally sound, I think. People in power like to maintain their power. And so when they make friends with those of us who are not in power, who are below them in the structure, they're not really doing it out of concern for us necessarily. They're doing it out of concern for their own interest. And there's always a partiality there. It's not it's not a relationship of equals. Bartonura has a comment on this one for us as well. He says, you who are communal leaders, even though you need to engage with the ruling authorities in order to do your job, be careful. And this is a really important recognition of the need for balance. And he's right. Communal leaders do need to engage with the ruling authorities. It's really important for me as a community rabbi to have a good relationship with our local MPs, because when a congregant comes to me and says they're having a problem with anti-Semitism in school, they're having a problem with getting their benefits, whatever it may be, I need to be able to pick up the phone to the right member of the local council cabinet, the right MP, and be listened to. I need to have that relationship. But at the same time, I need to not let that relationship become such that I'm pledging my troth to these politicians completely. I can't allow myself to be the rabbi who is in the back pocket of the leader of the local council because we have to maintain a sense of independence as well. And finally, here, there's something about not allowing ourselves, none of our local politicians do this, incidentally, they're all delightful, but it's something about not allowing ourselves to be used in some way or another. So when we invite ruling authorities to visit the synagogue, they're there because we've invited them and because we want to hear from them, not as a campaigning opportunity for themselves. They're not going to go away and post a photo saying, Brighton Hove Progressive Synagogue endorses us. That's not appropriate. We need to draw that line. The bedfellows concern, though, isn't limited just to ruling authorities, and that's where we come on to our next set of texts, which I've called Be Choosy. And that is based on this passage also from Pirkei Avot. Nittai the Arbelite used to say, keep your distance from a wicked neighbour and do not befriend an evildoer. And this is really what spoke to me about the rally, the anti-Semitism rally. I think there were wicked neighbours and evildoers there, and we're going to come on to what I mean by that. But first of all, let's look at Bartonura's comment. Keep far from a wicked neighbour so that you do not learn from their deeds, and furthermore, so that you are not struck down with them in their downfall. For woe to the wicked one, and woe to their neighbour. So starting off learning from their deeds. Obviously, this is not meaning learning from their deeds in a very direct way. If you hang around with a safe cracker, you're going to learn to break into safes. It's talking more generally about the fact that relationships mean we pick up things from each other. And that is, generally speaking, a fantastic thing. If none of us had any human relationships, we would be unchangingly and unchangeably the same for our whole lives. It would be a very miserable, static existence. We have friends, we have family, we have colleagues, precisely so that we share ideas, we fertilize each other, even unintentionally and subconsciously. But the problem when you've got people who are wicked in the language here, people who are beyond the pale, whatever the pale means, is the same principle applies. It still rubs off and you still absorb ideas. And that's where we come, for example, the idea of online radicalization. The more time you spend browsing neo-Nazi forums or Islamist forums, the more likely it is you'll become radicalized, even if your intention is absolutely not to. There is a huge amount of psychological literature about law enforcement officers who are involved in viewing harmful material, whether that's terrorist material, child abuse material. It has a real impact. It's unavoidable. And then the second sentence from Bartonura, so that you don't be struck down along with them in their downfall, for woe to the wicked one and woe to their neighbour. There's something very apocalyptic there. It feels, slightly Christian in some ways almost. The idea that the heavenly thunderbolt that comes and strikes the wicked neighbour might accidentally hit you when you're standing next to them. But again, on a more practical level, we're talking about hitching our star to someone's wagon. You can end up going down together. We all know from the Mandleton saga, from the Andrew Mountbatten Windsor saga, from all of these sagas, people who are associated with bad people, it really tarnishes them. They have gone down. People have lost their careers, not because they've done precisely the wrong things that these wicked neighbours did, but because they didn't distance themselves effectively. And that leads nicely on to Bartonura's second point. Do not befriend an evildoer, for as the sages said, whoever cleaves to the evil, even if they do not act as the evil do, receives a reward similar to theirs. It is like one who enters the house of a tanner. Even though they took nothing from the tanner, they nonetheless absorb a foul smell which lingers. And this is where we come to the idea that we are tarred with the same brush as the people with whom we associate. You go into the tanner's shop, you're not a tanner. You might not, I mean, tanners are probably lovely people. It's a little bit unfair that we're singling them out like this. But you go into the tanner's shop, you're not a tanner. You might not even have business with the tanner directly. You might just be delivering the post. Nonetheless, because you've been in there, something of the experience remains on you and is perceptible on you by others. And this is where we come on to that broader question of what does it mean to endorse views or to be seen to endorse views. So let's take the example of an open letter. If I sign an open letter, I'm definitely endorsing the content of the letter. I'm saying, I'm happy with this, I'm going to put my name to it. I'm not necessarily endorsing everyone else who has signed the letter, but Am I saying I am content to be listed alongside these people? That's a subtle difference, maybe too subtle for a lot of onlookers in the public sphere, but it's a really important one. And let's illustrate it with another example. Synagogues quite often like to host debate nights of some sort or another. We might have a debate about vegetarianism. We invite one speaker to say why vegetarianism is the only moral way forward. We invite another speaker to say why vegetarianism is not morally necessary. And then there's the discussion among the congregation. Now, obviously, the synagogue does not endorse both speakers. The synagogue cannot simultaneously be in favor of and against vegetarianism. But what the synagogue is doing by inviting these speakers is indicating that both of those viewpoints are suitable to be ventilated in the synagogue space, in a holy space. So we might have debates about vegetarianism. We might have debates about euthanasia. We might have debates about Israel-Palestine. But you never see a synagogue having a debate about whether or not Muslims should be allowed to vote. You never have a synagogue holding a debate about slavery, good or bad, bestiality, good or bad. Why not? Because one of those points of view in all three of those examples is unacceptable. And even though we wouldn't be being seen to endorse that view because we couldn't simultaneously endorse a view and its opposite, we are nonetheless giving it a hechsher, giving it a kosher certificate to say this is within the spectrum of reasonable views that we are content to be associated with. And I think that's where the Tanner example comes in. If the bad smell is in the room, it will linger on us, and so we have to keep away from that bad smell. A really useful framing for this comes from a book by Professor Teresa Bejan, who's written a book about the concept of civility, particularly in Christian Civil War era thought, but more generally as well, where she breaks it down into three questions. How much difference can we bear? How much must we share in order to make that difference bearable? And where should we draw the line? And for me, they're useful questions, but I'm not sure if I agree with number two. I'm not sure if I agree that the amount we share can necessarily conquer what we don't share, because the question is what we don't share. It's not about the percentage calculation, it's what it is. So if we take an example like Brexit, and we know that a huge number of human relationships broke down over Brexit, siblings, marriages in some cases, certainly friendships. And these are people who might agree on almost everything except Brexit. And for them, that was the red line. For me, that probably wouldn't be a red line. But the idea actually, it's not about the proportions. It's about the magnitude of the moral issue on the difference. And so if, for example, one of my friends agreed with me about absolutely everything except for Islamophobia, as in they were Islamophobic, I'm not Islamophobic, obviously. If that was that, it doesn't matter how much we share, I can't continue to maintain that relationship. And related to that, we have this idea of maintaining your individuality. And so we have this relatively well-known line from the book of Proverbs, Tov aruchat yarak, better a meal of humble greens where there is love than a fatted ox where there is hatred. In other words, if you end up on your own, that's okay. If you end up on your own by doing the right thing, by setting appropriate boundaries, that's right. But also, you're not going to end up on your own. There will be love. You might be on your own in the sense that you're not having the fatted ox, you're not at the top table, you're not being invited to Downing Street and Buckingham Palace on a weekly basis, but you're doing the right thing, no matter how humble the position where you end up. Going to move on to kind of the overarching ideology of why we as a Jewish community, not just as people, but as a Jewish community, will need to maintain our clean hands, our decent bedfellows. And it comes from this verse in Deuteronomy, V'haya machanecha kadosh v'lo ye'er b'cha ervat davar. Your camps shall be holy and no undesirable thing shall be seen. Now, interestingly enough, this is a verse that is, in its context, about toilet facilities. It is about the commandment that when the Israelite army was in battle, they have to dig latrines and have appropriate toilet facilities so that the place doesn't just become unhygienic. I think that is what we would call the Battle of Portaloo. Thank you. I got a great laugh last night. You're not gonna hear it because this is a post recording now, but it brought the house down. Your camp shall be holy, but even though the context was about toilets, it's been used to refer to moral cleanliness as well. And so we have Ibn Ezra, a Spanish commentator from around the 11th century, I think, looking at that phrase ervat davar at the end of the verse and saying, "B'ma'aseh or dibur," any undesirable thing in conduct or in speech. In other words, holiness means keeping a clear boundary of right and wrong around us, and wrongful conduct, wrongful speech in our camps, and our camps these days can refer to our synagogues, our movements, our community, our newspaper letter pages, all of these things that are around Judaism. It's supposed to be a holy environment. And ervat davar, the undesirable thing, undesirable conduct, undesirable speech, impairs that holiness. We are doing ourselves down by allowing undesirable things to enter our holy spaces. Finally, before I address some questions, we have this text from the Talmud. And it is about Rabbi Yishmael, who used to snitch to the Romans on members of the Jewish community, and the people on whom he snitched would be executed. Elijah encountered Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, and said to him, "Until when will you inform on the nation of our God and cause them to be sentenced to execution?" The rabbi replied, "What should I do? It is the king's edict." Elijah said to him, "Your father fled to Asia. You should flee to Laodicea." I've shared that because it is the perfect answer to the question that anyone who dissents from anything is always asked, the very sarcastic question often, which is, well, what's your alternative then? And the answer is, the alternative is flee to Laodicea. Not literally, because apart from anything, the Talmudic commentaries are a little bit conflicted about exactly where this Laodicea is. But the answer is, the alternative is just don't. The alternative is do the right thing and take the consequences. And so when I say, I don't think we should be at this rally against anti-Semitism, the question, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is don't go to a rally against anti-Semitism if the far right are among the organisers. Just don't. Flee to Laodicea. You don't have to do something that's wrong. And the fact that you can't think of anything better or more creative to do than doing the wrong thing, I think is a failure on an individual part rather than on the moral system with which we're dealing. That was a very whistle-stop tour through the texts on choosing our bedfellows. There were a number of questions last night that I'm going to summarize because, again, I'm post-recording this and answer briefly before I let you go on to watch the other fantastic sessions. First question was about that phrase, strange bedfellows. We get the phrase strange bedfellows often, and is my approach one that would rule out people having strange bedfellows, even when we've got clear historical cases when unusual alliances have been successful? And the example was particularly used of the Northern Ireland peace process. And it's a really good question. And I think the answer is in two parts. The first one is that the phrase strange bedfellows is used about 50-50 to mean good and bad in its connotations. Sometimes people say strange bedfellows in an attitude of awe and praise. Wow, Martin McGuinness and what's name signing that document together, they're strange bedfellows, but it worked out. It's amazing. Sometimes, though, it's used in a highly critical sense of, oh, no, Labour Party and, so and this Tory politician working together on a project, strange bedfellows. And I think ultimately for me, then, the question is not the strangeness of the partnership, but it's about the moral background to what's going on. It's also about the power of what's going on. So Northern Ireland is a fantastic example of strange bedfellows that worked basically miracles and brought peace to part of the country that had been riven by violent conflict for so long. And that's got to be worth any moral price if it's got the power to bring peace and success. And I think that's very different to a lot of the issues that I raised at the very beginning about signing open letters, about rallies, all that sort of thing, where actually we're talking much more about optics than practicality. If I had thought that the rally against anti-Semitism a couple of weeks ago would bring an end to anti-Semitism, yeah, of course I'd have gone to it, notwithstanding the far right. The point is, there was going to be no practical benefit to it because it's an important symbol, but anti-Semitism still exists. It did not completely extinguish itself 2 Sundays ago. And so for that reason, I think the moral basis is far more important than the identity of the parties. Another question was about the nature of power relationships and this difference between the idea of no platforming and censorship, which are very often treated as two sides of the same coin. And in terms of keeping our hands clean, in terms of choosing our bedfellows, very often that will result in people being no platformed. Does that equate to censorship? For me, the answer is almost always no. No platforming means we're not going to let someone speak from our platform that we control. Censorship means we're not going to let someone speak at all. It's very, very rare, if ever, that we have the opportunity to stop someone speaking at all. Like, I'm a rabbi in Brighton. There's very little I can do to stop the far-right groups involved in the rally from speaking in general. What I don't want them to do is speak under a brand that's connected with me. And so if we take an example from Sussex, much closer to home, Dr. Kathleen Stock was no platformed by the Sussex Students' Union over her views on trans issues. She complained that she was being censored, but she complained that she was being censored by making those complaints in the Daily Telegraph and the Times almost every day for 4 or 5 consecutive weeks. I just don't really think that that's censorship. She's been no platformed, but if you're able to speak in broadsheet newspapers on a daily basis, you've not been censored. And I think that is a really good place to draw all these strands together and say that ultimately the job of responsible leadership, but not just responsible leadership, the job of responsible citizenship, the job of responsible personship, is to consider these moral questions carefully. Sometimes they're more difficult than others, but the consideration is what's absolutely vital. And as we've seen from those Jewish texts, the ultimate aim is that our camp has to be holy. We need to be able, at the end of the day, to put our hand on our heart and say, I have done what I can to maintain the holiness of the sphere which I inhabit. Thank you very much for joining. Enjoy the rest of the sessions, and I hope to see you all soon.